So before looking into gender-based violence, I would like to setting out the basics, the brief definition of trans and non-binary people, and some key concepts to understand diverse gender. So the first of all, the gender identity is how individuals perceive or make sense of their gendered experience as a self. So it may or may not match the assigned sex at birth. So the trans and transgender refers to people whose gender identity does not correspond to sex assigned at birth, or those who live a gender which is different from the assigned sex. On the other hand, people who identify as same gender as a sex assigned at birth is called cisgender. So while the term gender identity is often associated with binary trans people who identify as woman or man, but it is often used as an umbrella term to include various genders, various gender or gender identities. So although gender identity has sometimes been confused with sexual orientation, which means a person's partner, romantic, and sexual attraction or lack of them, those two are different concepts. And also the non-binary people are those whose gender identity does not fit neatly into the category of woman or man. This is also an umbrella term, and the way in which people experience their gender can be very different. And non-binary people may identify as having both gender, both being somewhere between man and a woman, having a fluid gender, or rejecting any gender category at all. So yeah, it's up to the person who identifies as non-binary. And some non-binary people are also identified as trans, but others don't, depending on how they define trans and how they understand their gendered experiences. And additionally, some people may assume non-binary individuals look androgynous, but they do not necessarily present their gender in such a manner. Thus, it is impossible that, and can also be inappropriate to judge someone's gender based on their appearance. And some trans and non-binary people undergo an medical or social transition in order to mitigate their gender dysphoria or other reasons, but not everyone. So when you hear the word transition, you might imagine that the medical transitioning, such as surgery or hormonal replacement therapy. However, transitioning involves social aspects, such as changing pronouns, names, or clothing, and other gender expressions, so that a person can affirm their gender and feel more authentic. So there is no one right way to transition or to be trans or non-binary. So it's up to individuals to decide what kind of transition they need and want and to what extent. And also, I would like to introduce an interesting concept called gender modality. So it is used to understand the relationship between an individual gender identity and their assigned sex. The relationship may be other than cisgender or transgender. So this concept helps us to understand the complexity of people's gendered experiences, which cannot be reduced to the simple trans or cis binary. And finally, gender binary is a cultural and social system or process to classify individuals into two categories of gender, women and man. And also so those two categories are constructed as opposite and exclusively opposite. Yeah. And I would like to pose this question: is sex really binary and evident? So in many modern societies, most people were assigned female or male based on how their external genitals look like. So most people perceive biological sex as a binary model, and the societal and institutional structure have been designed to align with this binary understanding. However, so biologists have produced studies showing biological sex as a spectrum rather than simple exclusive binary. So sex is not only determined by external genitalia, but its development is influenced by a complex combination of factors, including genes, hormones, and secondary sex characteristics. And also it unfolds over time rather than following a fixed trajectory determined at birth. And this is a diagram to highlight the variation of sex development of human body, including intersex individuals. So there is a colorful line in the middle, and the left end is the green end is the typical biological female condition, and the purple, the right end, is a typical biological male condition. So you are not expected to read all of these tiny letters, but it is an interesting visualization of complexity of human bodies in terms of gender diversity. So you can find the link at the bottom right of this slide and check it out later if you are interested. So intersex people are those who were born or who endogenously developed sexual traits that differ from normative expectation of female and male bodies. It presents a complex combination of factors such as hormonal, genetic, and sexual organs create various conditions of sexual development. So people with intersex variations experience a diverse range of conditions. And other studies also pointed out that those who seem to have followed the normative path of sexual development may actually be atypical. So many people do not discover their intersex conditions unless they seek another medical check. And apart from intersex conditions, speaking of biological diverse human body, trans people undergoing hormonal replacement therapy have different hormonal levels from the average cisgender people. So they can experience secondary sexual development as the gender they transition to. So gender is often considered a social construct as opposite to sex, as evident and natural and determined purely based on biology. And critical scholars from feminism and gender studies have challenged this view, as sex is also socially constructed. So although not all scholars agreed on this view, the practice of assigning binary sexes to diverse human body is understood as an example of the social practices of producing and reproducing binary sexes. Having said that, sex as a cultural classification or social construction does not mean that sex is fake or insignificant. Biology does matter for trans, non-binary, intersex people, as well as cisgender people. And as we have seen, gender binary is a cultural and a societal system or process to classify individuals into two categories, women and men, and as opposite. So by categorizing diverse human beings into just two groups, the gender binary system works not only to erase those who fall outside the binary, but also to obscure this diversity within the categories and the commonalities across categories. So as I showed in the diagram, the sexual development of human body is much more complex and diverse than is commonly believed. And it is diverse and unfolds over time rather than it is determined at birth. At the same time, diversity in sex and gender modality, and gender identity is not only about intersex, trans, and non-binary individuals. In fact, cisgender women and men may also have biologically different bodies and different perceptions of their identities. So gender-based violence, trans and non-binary people must be understood in relation to cisnormativity and also the gender binary. And the cisnormativity is the social norms and the practices which assume cisgender to be normal and default. So this invalidates other gender modalities and identities, including trans and non-binary. and make them invisible, irrational, and pathological. And privilege. So in such a kind of cisnormative society, being a cisgender can be considered as considered privilege. Privilege is described as an unearned advantage based on social identities and often invisible to those who benefit from it. So gender modality can be counted as one of the social identities in the cisnormative society. So the hostility towards trans people has been seen in many parts of the world, even within feminism. So transphobia should be understood in relation to cis privilege. So far, I have focused on the key concepts of the terms to understand trans and non-binary people's identities and experiences. And now we move on to the second part of the presentation, understanding gender-based violence against trans and non-binary people. So the Council of Europe defined gender-based violence as any type of harm that is perpetrated against a person or group of people because of their factual or perceived sex, gender, sexual orientation, and/or gender identity. And gender-based violence can be sexual, physical, psychological, emotional, or socioeconomic, and it can take many forms, from verbal violence and hate speech on the internet to rape or murder. It can be perpetrated by anyone, a current or former spouse, partner, a family member, a colleague from work, schoolmates, friends, an unknown person, or people who act on behalf of cultural, religious, state, or interstate institutions. So according to UniSAFE and GenderSAFE's understanding of gender-based violence, the term is used to capture all forms of gender violence, violence and abuse that are based on gender, and goes beyond narrow legislation definitions. It captures physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, economic violence, sexual harassment, harassment on the grounds of gender in both online and offline contexts. Gender-based violence is understood and conceptualized as a continuum whereby seemingly innocent or mild forms of misconduct, when not addressed, tend to gradually escalate into more severe and grave forms of violence. On such a continuum, one can think of inappropriate questions about people's private lives, comments about one's looks, unintended bodily contact, sexist jokes, maneuvering victims into unwanted intimate encounters, and so forth, up to situations that involve physical and/or sexual violence and even rape. Violence is, in this understanding, used as an encompassing term that captures all stages of the continuum. And a look at this illustration. So this iceberg figure is a metaphorical representation of the different levels of violence that exist in society. The iceberg represents the visible and invisible aspect of violence. Beneath the surface, there are many other forms of violence that are less visible but can be just as damaging. These include psychological violence, such as threats, intimidation, and emotional abuse, as well as systemic violence, such as discrimination and exclusion, use of sexist language, and more. These forms of violence are often overlooked or dismissed, but they can have a profound impact on individuals and society as a whole. So earlier I mentioned that gender-based violence against trans and non-binary people must be understood with consideration of cisnormativity. This is because trans and non-binary people may experience challenges and discrimination that cisgender people do not experience due to structural and organizational environments designed around cisnormative and gender binary ideas. So for instance, trans and non-binary people often experience misgendering, such as being addressed with the wrong pronouns or by the wrong name. So university rules and facilities may also not cater for trans and non-binary people, which can make them difficult to access these facilities and maybe make them feel excluded. So if the support system for gender-based violence does not take trans and non-binary people into account, the trans and non-binary people may be reluctant to seek help due to their gender when they experience gender-based violence. So intersectionality is one of the key concepts for understanding the complexity of the multiple structural oppressions and power relations that underlie gender-based violence beyond comprehending the problem at the individual level. So gender-based violence is shaped by structural inequalities besides gender, for example, race, sexual orientation, age, disability, etc. So different groups face different inequalities in academia and also more or less exposed to gender-based violence with more or less consequences. So therefore, when addressing gender-based violence against trans and non-binary people, an intersectional perspective is indispensable. So for example, some studies show that trans women of color are disproportionately likely to experience violence due to the intersection of racism, misogyny, and transphobia. So hierarchical structure in universities combined with a competitive context can create and reinforce existing social inequalities, including gender-based violence. So addressing these inequalities is crucial for creating a safer and more inclusive academic environment. And I'd like to hand this presentation over to Anne now.
Yeah. Thank you, Chisato, for this really great overview of key concepts and the relevance of having this discussion about trans and non-binary issues in relation to gender-based violence in academia, in universities, in research performing organizations, as you might have seen, which is one of the acronyms that we sometimes use. We are organizing this training within the context of the GenderSAFE project, which is a project funded by the European Union and which seeks to address gender-based violence in academia more generally. And this is a project that follows on from another project called UniSAFE, which we've referred to. And in that project, in UniSAFE, what we did is we conducted the largest cross-cultural survey in Europe in the research sector on the topic of gender-based violence. And I thought after hearing some of the key concepts and key issues here, it was also important to just look at the numbers to actually see the scale of the problem itself. So the UniSAFE survey is a survey that had over 42,000 responses from staff and students. It was conducted in 14 different languages. We conducted that survey in 2022, so it's relatively recent. And it was done in 46 research performing organizations, so universities and other research centers in 15 countries in Europe. What we looked at in this survey is we looked at the prevalence of gender-based violence and its different forms. So what you can see, again, you will have access to the slides later, but some of the key highlights from this is that 62% of the respondents who took part in the survey told us that they had experienced at least one of the forms of violence that we asked about. 62%. That is nearly 2 in 3 staff and students. And the other one to just really look at is the scale of sexual harassment. It's just about 1 in 3. 31% of staff and students who participated in the survey reported having experienced at least one of the forms of sexual harassment that we talked about. But when we look beyond just these numbers, we see that the respondents that identify as LGBTQ+, those that report that they had a disability or chronic illness, or those that reported they were part of an ethnic minority group, they systematically said that we saw from the numbers that they were more likely to have experienced at least one incident of gender-based violence, so compared to others who did not identify with those characteristics. So let me show you a little bit of those figures again. It's just here you have that line, that blue line, that's 62%, which is the overall prevalence. And you can see, for example, on the basis of sexual orientation, if the respondents were queer, bisexual, or said that they had another sexual orientation not listed, they were systematically more likely to respond that they had experienced at least one form of violence. We see the same thing for disability and chronic illness here. So 72% was the prevalence of gender-based violence for those that said that they had a disability or chronic illness, compared to 62% overall. And then finally here, if you look at minority ethnic group, you will see that it's just also higher. So for those that say that yes, they are part of a minority ethnic group, 66% compared to 62%. But what I really wanted to show you here is that, in fact, what I haven't talked about yet is just what is the prevalence for non-binary people and trans people. What we see is that non-binary people are the most likely category of people to experience gender-based violence, and this compared to women and men. And we see the same dynamic with trans people compared to cis people. So again, here, if I show you the figures, being non-binary is associated with 75% prevalence compared to 62% overall. And for trans people, that is 73% compared to 62% overall. And these figures don't surprise me, but it's just always really interesting to just be able to quantify the scale of the problem. In the survey, we asked about people reporting incidents of gender-based violence, and as you can imagine, it's extremely low. It's about 13% that said that they had reported one of those incidents. And when we look at the reasons for not reporting incidents of gender-based violence, it is sometimes just the most prevalent here was being unsure if the behavior was serious enough to report, not recognizing the behavior as violence at the time, not thinking that anything would happen, even if they reported it. And that, for me, really speaks about the culture of the organizations. And when we talk about the culture of the organizations, often enough, we do not talk about culture in relations to non-binary and trans issues. We should not forget about the consequences and the impact that this has. These are general impacts, so just they affect everybody. But of course, it is likely that trans and non-binary staff and students are going to be impacted differently. If we look at the work-related consequences of experiencing gender-based violence for staff, they are most likely to feel dissatisfied with their job, to experience work productivity, or to consider leaving the academic sector overall. If we look at the right-hand side of the screen here in terms of the consequences for students, they might miss classes and not engage with learning opportunities. They might feel dissatisfied with the course of their studies, and of course, as a result, might experience reduced learning achievement. So a lot of lost opportunities as a result of violence. So we were very interested in looking at overall in the project at the root and the causes of gender-based violence. So what is causing gender-based violence in academic context? And in both the UniSAFE and GenderSAFE projects, we are working a lot on things like discrimination and biased practices, on gender stereotypes and harmful gender and cultural norms, on power inequalities and power dynamic, but increasingly also just trying to open conversations about systemic issues, particularly in relation to cisnormativity, binary gender norms, patriarchal power structures, toxic masculinity, and so on, which are just really essential when we talk about the gendered nature of gender-based violence. A little bit about the project itself for people that are not so aware of the 7P framework, which is used as part of the UniSAFE and GenderSAFE projects. They are based on what we call the 7P model, which has prevalence at its center, which is looking at addressing gender-based violence using prevention, protection, provision of services, the prosecution in case of incidents and disciplinary measures, and all of this done in partnerships with other stakeholders and organizations and framed by policy. So the model itself, I've talked a little bit about some of the different P's. Of course, prevalence is about trying to estimate the extent of gender-based violence and measure it. Prevention is really about changing behaviors and cultures. Protection, trying to avoid harm and further harm where needed. Prosecution is really going to be about handling cases of gender-based violence. Provision is about offering support and assistance. Partnerships about involving internal and external actors in policy, setting up measures and procedures. I mean, looking at this, the 7P framework is, of course, a very useful framework to just think about how we can just try and address the problem of gender-based violence in this. But just something that I want you to perhaps reflect on afterwards is just how do each of these 7Ps are going to be affected differently for different types of students and staff and students, and in particular for trans and non-binary staff and students. So some examples of that, it's just like why does it matter in particular for trans and non-binary students? What we could have is we could just really look at prevention measures in universities and other research organizations in terms of trying to work towards changing institutional cultures, and in particular addressing what Chisato was referring to as the cisnormative culture that is just really, really widespread in our universities. Partnerships, for example, might be just ensuring that there are partnerships with internal and external LGBTQ+ organizations, that just like healthcare providers are trained, aware, and so on. Legal aid agencies take these considerations, and so on. And then that in the policies, it's really, really important that there is greater explicit measures that are included on the protection of trans and non-binary people, when policies just too often just tend to revert to a very binary understanding of gender-based violence. So just here, just like these are just some examples, but I just wanted this opportunity, particularly in the participatory work that we will do after these presentations, to just reflect on these aspects. Before we go into a break, I just wanted to make everybody aware, particularly those that are less familiar with the GenderSAFE and UniSAFE projects, that as part of the UniSAFE project, we developed a toolkit which is available online at this link, and which has a lot of resources just on how to address gender-based violence in universities.
For explaining the UniSAFE survey and also the deeper understanding of gender-based violence, and also the results. The results of the survey, how the trans and non-binary people are kind of in a vulnerable situation in terms of gender-based violence.